Okay, stage 3 of our king and pawn ending mastery is going to be some practical positions. The way we are going to approach this video is by trying to solve everything like a problem. One of the things you can do as you study is try to treat everything like an OTB situation, over the board. So put some effort in to try to solve it and calculate it before I give you the answer. Now, these positions are sort of tricks and sort of, I don't want to say fun positions, because fun sometimes implies that they're impractical, and that is not the case. Before we moved on, I decided that before we move on to the very difficult, the big three as I call them, the master concepts of how to get opposition. As I said, opposition is the tool you use to win, let's say, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, assuming you've watched the 2 videos. Then I said there would be tools to use to get opposition. And they are flanking. You can learn both defensive and offensive flanking. Triangulation, which is something I've already referred to, a very famous concept. And corresponding squares. Corresponding squares is something that can be referred to as sort of basic or advanced, but ultimately it's kind of the daddy point, the master point of king and pawn endings, which is the ability to recognize where you need to be on in terms of the square, no matter where your opponent is on the board. From distant to close doesn't matter. Knowing your corresponding squares and whose move it needs to be. Those are the daddy concepts we are going to be getting into. A little bit of a preview. Before we do, we are going to solve some practical positions that semi-reinforce the ideas we've already learned and semi-preview the ideas that are to come. So, this position here is a position where white is playing and the king is already within the box. If you remember, we have a box based on where the pawn is and the 2 queening squares, both right directly and diagonal. The king is within the box. So if you simply push forward, the king is going to catch you. You push, he is going to catch you. Okay? The easiest way to win this is simply to change the nature of the box by white making a sacrifice. D6, exclamaviach. Black has to take the pawn, and now when white pushes, black is unable to maintain the box because his own pawn is in the way. If he tries to come on a diagonal, he is too slow. And if he tries to come straight and around, he is too slow. And if he tries to push, he is too slow. If white tries to push, as I already alluded to, black is going to catch the pawn. Now, white can try to move the king forward, which in many cases here has put black in some sort of zugzwang. He cannot directly attack the pawn. If he tries to sacrifice this pawn to clear space, now he is unable to stop both pawns. Does he have enough time to come around? The answer is actually no. White reaches it just in time. So white has 2 ways to win this. One is to recognize the box, but put black in a zugzwang situation and only then bring the king forward. But the most direct is to eliminate the box by making a sacrifice, taking away the squares from the enemy king, and then making progress. That is position 1 and a very practical idea to know. It's the beginning of understanding the breakthroughs, where you start to understand this concept that in king and pawn endings, it's not always how many pawns you have left. It's who gets a queen first. So making a sacrificial breakthrough is something that is a repeated pattern throughout your learning process. Next position. A very famous one, and one that you're going to look at, and if you haven't seen the idea before, at first it's a mind teaser. It just doesn't play well on the intuitive process of the brain. White to play in this position. Your pawn on c6 is 2 squares from getting a queen. That's awesome. We love that. But black's pawn, although further from getting a queen, is impossible to catch for the king, for the white king. At least impossible without any other sort of threat. So the question is, what can white possibly do in this position? How does he make progress without simply letting black make 2 moves to take the pawn, knowing that you have almost no chance of catching the black pawn? It's impossible to see until you understand the dynamics and the geometry of the chessboard. So, what is the concept here? I'll give you a few minutes to think about it. Okay, assuming you've taken a second to figure this out, we're going to take a look. The drawing idea, you must first play the only logical move. If you push this pawn, he's going to take it. So you play king to g7. Still not necessarily sure if you're making progress, but you have to bring the king closer somewhere. He has two moves. He can come forward and try to take your pawn, or he can push. Let's say he comes forward to try to take your pawn. Here's where you see our first key idea in action. We play king to f6. Now, still seeming like this is hopeless, it's not like we're defending this pawn, but we are threatening to trap his pawn. So if he takes our pawn, it's an easy draw. So he pushes. Now we need to somehow do both things. We need to get closer to taking this pawn, but also try to defend this pawn. And there is one square that achieves that goal. e5. e5 is a key move that not only places your king along the box, by the way, places your king along the box, meaning that if he takes it, you're able to trap the pawn, but also threatens to come closer to the other pawn. If we both simply push forward, both sides will make queens at the same time. He can't stop you, because any move he makes with his king is one more move you can make with your king. So we see this concept in action where our king is actually using the geometry of the chessboard, which is sometimes, even though it doesn't look the same way to the eye, a diagonal reach is just as clear as a straight file reach when it comes to a race. That's the beauty of the king, right? So if we look at it again, what if instead of simply coming forward, he just starts pushing and says, do you really even have a chance? Well, you start to notice the dynamics that if he pushes too far, it's now irrelevant for us to catch the pawn because our king has improved himself. As long as we remember to play this move first, which threatens to queen with check, either he queens and we both queen at the same time, or we come forward and the game is a draw. This is a famous composition, and one that, although it does not seem totally practical, is actually an idea I personally used in a real game, understanding the ability to create a threat with the king along a diagonal to trap an enemy pawn, and also make progress toward another goal at the same time. Really important concept to get your brain around, and as we start to look at more difficult things, all these concepts sort of pile on top of each other that we've done in the first 3 videos, and will improve your knowledge to solving much more difficult positions. Now we move on to another position, which is something that executes an idea that we have learned in both fashions. Two things we've learned. White to play in this position. Before I give you any answers or clues, you may take a few minutes to try to solve what you would try to do in this position as white. Okay, assuming you've done so, we're now going to look at the fact that this is a very tricky position. You may have calculated the basic idea of king to f2, king to d7, king to g3, king to e6, king to h4, king to f6, and white wins the h5 pawn. Not only do you win the pawn, but if you notice, if you've already remembered the distant opposition idea I taught you, unless he is able to get some form of direct opposition, he is not going to be able to draw. Again, we see the idea. Seems very direct and very straightforward, and Danny has completely lost his mind. This is no difficulty at all. But if you did not anticipate the best moves from your opponent, then shame on you. As you notice, all these positions have some sort of concept and trick. After king to f2 for white, black is going to play h4. Now the idea is that you say, well, thank you very much for getting me one step closer to winning the pawn. But then you see an unexpected shot, which is h3, exclamavich. Now you may notice as soon as he takes the pawn, what do we have here? Danny's not totally crazy. By sacrificing the pawn, the king is just inside the box and he will catch you in time. You know you don't have any hope of coming forward with the king because, as you've already learned, the corner pawn is not able to win. In this situation, as long as the king reaches in front of the pawn, the game is a draw. So if we come directly forward, we have to anticipate this idea of h4. Now, if we come around to g1, and perhaps you saw this idea of h4, and you said, well, I need to come slower so that I can get my king to h2, which in turn would prevent him from playing h3, because I can take with the king instead of the pawn, avoiding the corner pawn. Well, that would be smart of you, and that would be the next step in your thinking, hopefully. Unfortunately, you're too slow. If you do simple math, king d7, king h2, king e6, king h3, king f6, king h4, he gets to the pawn in time. If he's defending that pawn, you have no chance of winning. So king g1 would be nice, but it does not do the job because you are too slow. Well, now we're frustrated. We wanted to play king f2 because of Danny's stupid pawn sack. We're unable to do this. We'd like to play king to g1, but because it's too slow, we are unable to do this. How can you combine the ideas here of distant opposition and also not allowing him to make this pawn sacrifice? There's only one way to do it. You can have another couple of minutes to think if you wish, but I'm going to move forward. You play king to f2, exclamavich, and after h4, the king comes back to g1, double exclamavich, twins. You've made almost a waiting move, but in doing so, although it first seems unappealing to the eye, it's counterintuitive. If you remember that the more you learn king and pawn ending concepts, it doesn't always matter if it looks pretty. The board is dynamic. The geometry of the board is dynamic, and the king is one of the only pieces, besides the queen, that can guard every square around it. So the king can make just as much progress on diagonals as it does on straight forwards. If you actually do the math in terms of how many squares it takes to get to the king, coming to g1 is not that much slower. The fact that he has pushed the pawn means that now, when he comes forward, he is unable to reach either the defense of the pawn or direct opposition, which is what he needs to hold. Once again, diagonal opposition will not work for the defender. If he goes here, we will go here, preparing to march. And if he goes directly in front, we will take our opposition again and rinse and repeat, just like the lady told us to do on the shampoo commercial. So, remember this idea, a very tricky one. And I'm not going to start immediately moving from basic concepts to very tricky positions. I would doubt the majority of you were able to solve that in a given time frame, assuming you even did. I've had master students who weren't able to solve it within a couple minutes. But if you look at the video a few times and you start to familiarize yourself with those ideas, it's about becoming more practical with your knowledge, not just assuming that these technical ideas, execute themselves while you're asleep. You have to anticipate multiple defensive ideas for your opponent. And hopefully, the more you experience positions like that, and maybe you have to experience them in a real game by losing your focus and actually blowing a point in a tournament, which hurts your feelings, so then you actually remember it, right? I saw a brain study the other day that said people remember things that have some sort of emotion attached to it. So instead of losing a game and then crying about it and only then remembering the ideas, why don't you slap yourself in the face right now and make yourself cry so that there's emotion attached to this idea that Danny's trying to teach you. And then you'll remember the idea better if the brain neurosurgeons are accurate about emotion needing to be attached in order to remember things. I don't know if that's really true, so don't slap yourself in the face, please. Treat yourself well. So, remember this concept. Now we move on. Something we haven't done yet is add a couple pawns on the board. But rather than adding 2 pawns, connected pass pawns, and giving you a simple position, something like this is always winning. 2 connected pass pawns against 0 are always winning, regardless of where they are, even in the corner. There is not even really a necessary knowledge of opposition. But what I do want to show you is one important trick that can possibly happen as you move forward if somehow you reach this position here. You've managed to get 2 pass pawns about as far as they can be, and it seems as though the position should be easily winning. But white has a little bit of trouble making progress. In fact, if the king won either one of these 4 squares right now, the game would be a stalemate. So again, making some sort of triangulation idea, trying to trick your opponent, is not necessarily going to help. Instead, you have to understand a different trick, something that we executed in an earlier example, the last video, stage 2. Remembering that if you know a position is winning, it doesn't matter how many pawns you have left. What matters is that you get a queen. So the one way for white to win this is, drum roll please, sacrifice of the corner pawn so that the king may come forward and take opposition, either on f6 or h6, both win. And when the king goes back, we see that the timing works out for the squeeze, and we win the endgame. It's tricky only to realize that because that position is not a traditional king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th. Let me set it up again. Go directly to it. Because that position is not a traditional king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, you seem to have broken a rule in that the pawn is in front of the king, which is the only reason why people get stuck with this. They actually have to calculate. They have to actually calculate that coming forward is not going to end in a stalemate. An important concept to know, and one I wanted to add to our basic knowledge before we move on. Again, we are going to be covering much more complicated things, so hopefully people are following the recipe of studying these videos one at a time. As your muscles are being built, just like reps at a gym, okay, we will eventually get to a much bigger weight, and you will be able to lift it if these concepts have really stuck with you. These are more practical tricks, but they are still, exactly like I said, practical. The next position is a fun position. But again, we imply fun only in the sense that it's something to solve, and maybe not the most likely position to occur in a game, but an important idea to understand. Many of you may have seen this position, as it's a pretty famous one. We are not going to cover this one just for kicks and giggles. We are getting toward a much more complicated idea, the more practical application of this concept. It is white to play, and you have a few minutes to figure out what you do here. Okay, assuming you've taken those few minutes, how does white win this? Is white even winning? If you haven't been able to see a clear way for white to use his pawns, then you may notice that you're in a much worse off situation. As the kings make their progress toward the pawns, who's going to win? I'd say black is. Much shorter distance. Example, if the pawns become locked, the black king is much closer. If you're lucky, you'll get a draw by getting some sort of opposition when you get over there and be able to hold down a pawn. But even that is maybe unlikely. Okay, so with that said, how can we make a breakthrough, knowing that the black king is closer and that we must get a queen before his king can catch our pawns? We remember this idea that the breakthrough is more important than how many pawns you have left, and we push the middle pawn. The board is now split, and he must capture it. He must capture the pawn in one way or another. Whichever one he does gives us our first example of the language used in the book Pawn Power in Chess by Hans Kamak, a book I recommend. And as we get into more basic descriptions of the pawns, this is an entire series designed for beginners to understand pawn play. You will see more and more of that lingo used. And here we see a pretender. A pretender is a pawn that, regardless of its position being attacked, if for that moment or if for a long time there are no pawns directly in front of the file, the pawn has the potential to become a queen if there is help. So this pretender is created when he takes with this pawn. Now the problem is, okay, if you push, he's still going to take it. So it's not like he's a pretender about to become, a contender. How do we make him a contender? We sacrifice a second pawn, forcing him to capture, and then we move forward. You see that it's not even close that white will be queening before black does. If he takes with the f-pawn, we see the same concept. The opposite side of the board is sacrificed, and white queens. This is a very important concept to understand. It's a breakthrough concept that will help you as you get to more and more practical positions. You must always be calculating breakthroughs and sacrifices, regardless of the opposition ideas you learn. You cannot miscalculate, because again, it doesn't matter how many pawns are left if someone has a queen. So, sacrifice, slam, jam, bam. Now, the next position that executes this idea is again a slightly more practical one. This position is known as the grip. The grip is a pawn structure that actually occurs directly from certain openings, including the Caro-Kann advanced variation in some lines. If you review the game between Kramnik and Leko from their World Championship match in 2004, you'll see that this pawn structure was a feature within the game that black was worried about achieving. Did not want to give white this type of space, and that actually affected the outcome. You can check out that game. In this position, white needs to make a breakthrough once again because his king is completely out of position. If it becomes down to a straight race, black will win. So you can take a few minutes if you want. Assuming you pause the video, we move forward. White can start by pushing either pawn, f-pawn or g-pawn, because in any case, the enemy is not able to take, as you can see, instantly giving you a pretender who will be helped by his friend and become a contender. Example, we push, chopalicious, the game is over. So we can push either way, and this is the case. He cannot take it, so he moves the king. Now, we need to make progress as quickly as we can, but the king is getting closer. The only way to do this in the most efficient way that he cannot stop you is by sacrificing a second pawn. Immediately looks strange to the eye, but you notice that can't take this way because we make a sacrifice, followed by turning our pretender into a contender, and the game is over. If he takes this way, rinse and repeat, just like Shampoo Lady says. So he moves the king forward, But in any case, we were threatening the third breakthrough, which is pushing this pawn, splitting the board, and we take care. This is known as a lever. When you have a chain, this is a lever. By eliminating the base pawn, you are able to eliminate the lead pawn, which in many cases becomes a passer. Again, that is pawn power in chess lingo by Hans Kamak. That is a lever, eliminating the chain. There are both defensive and offensive levers. A chain lever is an offensive lever where you can eliminate the base pawn, followed by creating a passer for yourself. And we see that idea executed to the fullest here in the grip. And the game is over. Notice that we don't push this pawn, only because if he takes it and we take here, the king is close, and he's able to catch us. So we see the grip in action. Before we move on to the final daddy position I will leave you with, I will show you, as I said, what a defensive lever is. I just showed you an offensive lever, where you remove a chain pawn, a base pawn, to create a passer. Here is a defensive lever. In this position, I need to make it black to move. In this position, with black to move, he has a chance to use a defensive lever trick, a fork trick. You can call it the fork lever or defensive lever, where you sacrifice this pawn, forcing him to capture, and you move directly in front. For the moment, you are down 2 pawns. However, the king must move. You take this pawn, and if you've done your homework, boys and girls, you know that this position is already a draw. Black is holding the position by coming straight back from the pawn. And this process will repeat all the way up the board until we have a stalemate by force. So that is your defensive lever trick. Our final climax position is one that is a really fun one. And again, fun meaning this position is technically not impossible, but is completely improbable. However, because it is a max version of these breakthrough ideas, both the first breakthrough we did with the 3 pawns, and then the grip idea, because it is an extreme version of that, and therefore more complicated, it's a good one to practice and a good one to know. In fact, the climax idea of this position is something I've actually used to win a game, an important game in my career, king and pawn ending trick, that we add on top of it. Believe it or not, only one move in this position wins for white. Only one breakthrough move. You can take a second to find it. You'll probably need about 5 minutes at least. Go ahead and pause the video if you wish to do so. Otherwise, we are moving forward. White must first split the board. What white wants to do is find some way to get this king to have to guard one of the sides of the board so that he can make the breakthrough on the other side of the board. Now, the problem, as you see, is that we don't even have the pawns on the 5th rank. We have the pawns on the 4th rank. So it requires another level of accuracy. What do I mean by that? If you push forward and just start making sacks, and you're not actually threatening anything, his pawns are almost as close to queening as yours are. You're not as far ahead of him. So you need to keep that in mind. White wins by playing the move d5, exclamaviach. Now, black will typically take with the e-pawn whatever pawn is closest to the king first, because he's not allowing a breakthrough. The king is already in position. So we take back, and now we are forcing him to take. Otherwise, we take and we're winning. Now, in order to create the furthest past pawn we can from the king, we need to play a5. At first, players calculate things like here. If they're assuming bad moves like this, they think they get moves like this and then a5, and you're really excited, right? But of course, the problem is he can take this way. Again, forcing the direction toward his king, and you're out of luck. So you play a5 and split. Now the furthest pawn that can be created away from the king is the b pawn. Black has to take it. We get a race position, at the end of which his king easily catches our pawn, and seems like we should resign. However, what do we have on the other side of the board, boys and girls? That's right. We sacrifice this pawn, followed by creating our own breakthrough, our second breakthrough, and we notice something. He can't stop both pawns. However, if you calculate, it looks as though he's about to queen at the same time. But the final concept we apply here is perhaps the most practical and key part of knowing the answer to this position. The idea of sacrificing this pawn with check, which therefore forces a queen with check. What you'll notice is that you if you had calculated this further in advance, you did a very good job. If you had seen that idea coming, because it's the only reason why the position is winning. And maybe you will never reach this position, this insanely impractical position. Of course you won't. But you will reach king and pawn endings where you're calculating, I go there, he goes there, I go there, he goes there, where both sides have multiple passed pawns, multiple ways of pushing forward, and you're starting to get in trouble. So in that case, you need to know where the position is headed. And having knowledge of that type of idea where you make a sacrifice with check and only then complete the problem by queening is a very, very important concept, despite the perhaps improbableness of this position. Very important concept to understand. Oops. And we see it executed one more time, that by sacrificing that pawn with check, we win the endgame. The queen will pick up every pawn one at a time. So, for beginners, hopefully the difficulty of this position was not, of this video, was not too much. And hopefully you made an effort to try to solve things. Your score is not totally relevant at this point. But the first 3 videos should hopefully be building some muscles, building some knowledge that will help you as we move further down the road and we see exactly how far down the rabbit hole goes. Talk to you guys later.